Hi, I'm Ralph Rivas.
And I'm Aika Ray.
At ngayon ay pag-uusapan natin ang election surveys in the Philippines by the numbers. So
Hello.
ayan. Hi. Hi, Aika. So yun, election surveys, babad ka sa field. Actually, nasa field ka ngayon
Yes.
for ano for campaign
For
duties. So kumusta?
yes.
Kumusta diyan?
Actually, share ko na rin na Senator Manny Pacquiao is here in Pangasinan right now. So, ito yung first foray niya into Marcos territory, no? So, it's quite interesting to say the least. But, hindi naman siya, I mean, even if it's Marcos territory, a lot of people actually went to see him because after all, he's a boxing superstar, diba? So, there.
Hmm. So he's really going there to woo the supporters of the front
Yes.
runner based on surveys. At
Surveys.
surveys, yan mismo yung pag-uusapan natin ngayong hapon. Today, we're joined by Peter Caton, Associate Professor of the University of the Philippines School of Statistics. Hi, Peter. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to tell our audience na we are live. So if you have any questions to us, to Peter, type lang kayo dyan sa Facebook, sa Twitter, or kung saan kayo nanonood sa YouTube. Now, Peter, simplehan lang natin at hindi
Okay.
naman lahat ay nasasama sa mga surveys. Ilang libo lang ng mga tao yung nasasama sa mga surveys at tinatanong kung sino yung gusto nilang candidate. Then here comes survey companies saying na sinasalamin daw nito ang pulso ng bayan and it reflects the sentiments of the entire nation. Even though thousands of people lang yung kasama sa survey, help us make sense of this. And can surveys really do this and conclude na ito yung sinasalamin na sentimiento ng buong bayan?
So with surveys kasi, well, they cannot really survey all of the Filipino voting population kasi that would be a very costly endeavor. Too costly that we only do it every election season. And for companies to survey all of us, that would be akin to just doing that private company doing elections. So at some point, they would have to really reduce how many they were going to get so that it becomes economical, but still be able to gather insights through the use of statistics and probability. So with regards to sample size, through sample size, na kahit thousands lang, it really factors in with regards to how they designed their surveys. They have to take into account their margin of error. They cannot be they cannot have zero error because they're just going to be sampling a small number of individuals in our voting population. So there's going to be the margin of error. So that's one thing that will happen. Now, because they're also serving a small group, there's going to be a chance that they will be wrong or they will be grossly exceeding their margin of error. So that's where level of confidence comes in. These are being considered by a lot of survey firms. Yung level of confidence that they can get it right, and also the margin of error of within they think they can be right or wrong. Besides that, they have to also make their surveys really representative. So they have to take into account how they would be able to represent as much as of the Filipino population as possible, given also their own costs of doing these surveys. So sometimes you might hear certain groupings of individuals na parang ang ginagawa nila is NCR, the rest of Luzon, also known as Balanced Luzon. In some surveys, they split this up to Northern and Southern Luzon, which is also good, and Visayas and Mindanao. Now, generally, this would be the level that they could be good enough or confident enough with their results. Technically, they can still analyze into the finer regions or finer provinces, but in analyzing that was not their focus. So there's a large margin of error or large chance that they can be wrong. So in those cases, they have to really just work on that level. It is on that level that they budget their sampling, they allocate accordingly.
Okay, so several big words out there that you mentioned. Margin of error, confidence interval, tama ba? Oh my God. I
Level
failed
of
my stat one
confidence, level
once.
of confidence.
Level of... So yun, the kailangan ma-factor in yun. And of course, the sampling. So very briefly, walk us through those concepts and how important those are in to determine na okay, maganda ang pagkakagawa ng isang survey.
So first, margin of error. It's really just the maximum amount of error that a survey firm could deviate from what could be the true proportion of those that would vote or not vote a certain candidate. So yun yung margin of error technically. It's that maximum allowable error na they think their survey is close to what is the true proportion of those who would vote. Now, note that that margin of error, there's a chance na pwedeng ma-exceed yun because again, probabilities, there's a chance that surveys could get it wrong. And that is factored in by taking into account what we call the level of confidence. Generally, the level of confidence is going to be that minimum probability of this case, common yung 95% chance. So, parang 95% minimum, pwedeng maging, we think na tama yung survey. So, or we think na tama yung survey na within the margin of error. So, that's how you could look at the level of confidence. Commonly, 95% yun. And it's pretty academic yung 95%. Now, ibig sabihin may 5% at 5% at most chance na mali yung survey. And that's because di naman talaga by how small they're getting in terms of the sample size. So, and also with possible changes in behavior of people in terms of how they would answer surveys. Note that these surveys, all of these, are just dipping into what is the state of the country in terms of their opinions. Opinions can change in time. So in that way, there would be still some wiggle room in terms of what could really happen later in the election.
Okay, so Peter, I think siguro hindi lang naman question ko to, no? But I think question din to ng ibang tao. Parang, is there any parang certain percentage kung ilan dapat yung babae o yung lalaki? As in, like, meron ba dapat gano'n na definite ratio, mga gano'n? Kung matanda o bata, single or married, ganyan. So I guess we just want to know kung meron mga ganong klaseng background na tas meron bang mga prescriptive ratios na kailangang gawin ng isang polling firm.
Now, with regards to some demographics, these are really some of the internal practices. Pero at the end of the day, well, you don't really see a lot of the demographics of the survey respondents. These are more internally available with survey companies. Pero the general idea is it should be as much as reflective of the Filipino population. So yun naman yung general principle na dapat they try their best to be as representative within the context of the Filipino population.
Okay.
Now
Sige.
ako may follow up ako diyan kasi yung the big picture is well, big picture we look at the big picture using the surveys by interviewing a small number of the population. So yung pagpili nito, kailangan meticulous ba na parang this person represents, I don't know, the sentiments of 1,000 or 100,000 people. Parang ganun yung logic ng ano, 'di ba, ng surveys basically. So but then again, there are also practices na random kung sino-sino lang yung sino-survey. 'Di ba? Parang I remember in my statistics classes, there's a stratified random sampling, simple random sampling. 'Di ba? Parang may mga two-step na maraming types of sampling. Pero pagdating dito sa mga nakikita natin, let's say the big ones, SWS and Pulse Asia, Anong sampling method ba yung ginagamit nila?
Now, with specific companies like SWS or Pulse Asia, generally they would make available their technical notes. But let me just talk about this. Um, in designing surveys and sampling individuals for surveys, there's both a mix of being meticulous in terms of really how you would start selecting samples, and also still having some scientific randomness in play. Now, the meticulousness would be, for example, how far do you want your estimates to be as accurate or as representative as possible? Generally, with a lot of these survey firms, they can go up to the macro regions that we called earlier, yung Metro Manila, Balance, Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao. And then, in terms of how would they select the next level below, like for example, individuals, they would still employ a mix of meticulousness and randomness. In which case na yung sinasabi mga stratified random or cluster sampling, oftentimes, this might be diving into a lot of the different technical notes, pero parang they would first select a random set of provinces, or then randomly select groups of barangays, and from within those randomly selected barangays, a random selection of individuals. Now, if a household has more than one voting individual or likely voter, then there's another level of randomness that's typically done. This is a pretty general approach to sampling. Pero the idea here is uh, proper survey firms, proper proper firms that do ethical research would have a mix of meticulousness, knowing that they can be accurate up to a level, pero also still having that scientific randomness na parang talagang it takes into account of how could representation be accounted for. Generally, with these surveys, based on this mix of being meticulous and still doing random processes, they magkakaroon ng weights. Yung weights na yun yung parang number of representativeness. Uh, how many individuals would one person uh, from this one area could represent for their area in terms of respondents. So those are some things that are typical, yeah.
Okay, so
Okay.
yung na ano ko doon is at the national level, all regions, and then from these regions nagkakaroon ng ang tawag dito, pinipili lang din kung ano yung mga areas per region,
Yeah,
correct?
okay, yeah.
And then from those that were selected dun sa mga areas na yon, yung mga barangay nara-randomize din, correct?
Yes.
Okay, okay. So Ika,
Kasi hindi
you were
naman
about.
nila kayang kasi hindi naman nila kayang i-survey lahat ang barangay. That would be very transportation inefficient. Na parang lahat
Uh,
ng barangay sa Pilipinas i-survey nila, so they can't do that. Some survey firms can survey all of the provinces, pero still there's a lot of transportation planning with those aspects. Some survey firms might not be able to do surveying all of the provinces, so again, you have to read the technical details of these survey firms. That's why we always advocate, a lot of statisticians advocate that if you're going to do surveys of public interest, you have to give your technical notes so that it could be contextualized with how the results of the survey could be analyzed.
mm,
Yeah. So interesting ano na you mentioned yung tungkol sa technical notes, which is something that I think common Filipinos won't actually really delve into, no? So I guess siguro just to add to the discussion, I just want to ask kung how does face-to-face surveys and yung mga online or text, yung kasi 'di ba during the pandemic nag mobile or internet survey sila. So what do you think are the pros and cons yung magkaibang survey types? Kasi of course sometimes people think na baka hindi credible yung face to face, ay hindi credible yung mobile versus face to face. So what are your two cents on that?
So for me, on these kinds of surveys, I typically look at uh, how could they resolve the representation problem. Now, with face to face, yun kasi yung parang madaling ma-justify yung representation problem na talagang pupunta sila dun sa lugar and they would do the survey. Now, with mobile surveys, ang problem of representation dito ay hindi lahat ng Pilipino may mobile phone na kayang sumagot
Right.
ng mobile survey. So, may ganun tayong problema. Unang problem ko dyan is the problem of representation. Another problem is that generally, those that would answer these mobile surveys or online surveys, they have this volition to participate. They opt in. And yun yung medyo risk na parang uh, yung mga sumasagot nito, sila yung gustong sumagot. And oftentimes, these could be very motivated. And these do not necessarily represent what could be of those na hindi naman sila motivated sumagot or hindi naman sila merong mobile phone. So may mga ganong question. Now with certain online surveys, depende siya kung paano dinisenyo yung online survey. If we're going to depend like on Facebook likes, emoticons, Twitter polls,
Mm-hmm.
may certain problems and limitations yung mga ganong avenues. Especially for I use the Twitter poll for example. Okay yung Twitter poll with your if you're a content creator and if you want to get the opinion of your followers and other aspects. Pero if it is going to be of a national concern, medyo limited yung Twitter poll, especially with regards to choices. And if you're gonna have, and we have a lot of choices for candidates, and way beyond the limit of Twitter. I think ang limit ng Twitter ay 4. So if you design a Twitter poll in that simplistic way, again, you opt-in representation, and then you have this trolling behavior and also
Mm-hmm.
double counting or double voting, which is something that never happens really in in elections. With Facebook naman, the Facebook is really much open to a lot of people, and trolling behavior could be common. And there could be some representation from those that are not necessarily accounts or not necessarily Filipino voters. So may mga ganun kang problema in terms of representation. So generally for me, a survey, a well-designed survey really has to answer the question of whether it is a representative survey.
Okay.
Mm.
So, good point yung sinabi mong representation, no? Because, yun nga, di ba, since I'm covering the campaign right now, some supporters and even the candidates themselves, actually, parang they express skepticism sa survey results. Especially now na we're seeing a majority of the prospective voters based on the surveys are voting for the front runner. So, sa tingin mo ba parang meron ba talagang chance na hindi tugma sa realidad itong mga surveys? Not to cast doubt on them, no? But I guess parang just to um I guess to evaluate kung ano man yung sentiments ng mga candidates themselves and of course yung mga supporters na nagtatanong.
So one thing to think about these surveys, they are done in a specific point in time. They're only a snapshot of that point in time with a lot of context in terms of what had happened in that point in time. And these surveys are just only taking a dip on what is happening in terms of the different voting opinions and behaviors of of our voting population. So it is it is something to be very careful to reflect what is happening today that it could be reflecting for me. Marami pang pwedeng mangyari. Pero at least you know that at this point, ito yung point of view ng tao. But a lot of things could still change. It will depend still pa rin in terms of what could happen in those next few days before the election. And so, yung ganong parang na ganun na parang discourage or may mga sentiments about what we're seeing in surveys. Well, if it is a properly designed survey, then we just take it as it is. If it is a properly designed survey, and note that these are what we are seeing, but this is a specific point in time. Opinions, emotions, perceptions, and also the nature of the ground can change and still has a lot of room for change.
Mm. Now ako, I want to ask about how surveys are conducted. Kasi, it's political questions are quite polarizing. And to an extent, Filipinos avoid talking about it. Then here comes a stranger, magpapakilala na, oh, ako, magsasurvey po ako kung sino ang napupusuan ninyong kandidato for this 2022 elections. And that's, di ba, parang hindi ba factor yun? And parang magsasabi na lang sila ng, I don't know, even though hindi yun yung gusto nilang kandidato, they just say kung sino yung iboboto. For instance, nung karamihan ng mga kapitbahay nila na nakikinig din sa survey, or ano ba, may kailangan ba one-on-one lang yun? Or ginagawa ba yun sa paligid ng barangay? Mga ganyan. Paano ba dapat ang tama?
It really reminds me of my Stat 143 survey operations in my undergrad. But this is how you would typically do it. First of all, not necessarily volunteers, but survey interviewers are or should be professionally trained. And in this case, they're professionally trained to not show non-verbal cues, non-verbal communication. Kasi interacting with humans would really be changing how we would answer. That is something that is documented. So they are trained to mute their nonverbal cues if they are properly trained survey interviewers, and a lot of reputable survey firms have these because they know it has an impact. Besides that, there are ways in which questions are delivered and questions are designed. Generally, questions should have should not be probing. Questions should be just as they are and should not be motivating to answer in one way or the other. Um, choices are generally laid out without a specific order oftentimes, because I do remember in my survey operations experience na parang every time we have to survey another person, we have to jumble together the different options, even though kahit strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree lang yung mga opinions, yung mga options na yan. You have to jumble them all together so that may way na hindi na influence nung structure of the question yung magiging answer. So generally, as I'm saying this now, there are ways to that properly designed surveys ethically by surveys with proper research ethics could make that the conduct of the survey should have minimum effect to how the person should answer.
And a follow-up to that, kasi pag surveys, kasi ako personally, kapag halimbawa kapag sa restaurant, yung mga ganong simpleng surveys na may mga isi-shade ka, may namadali ko na yun para lang makaalis, or I don't know, get a voucher or whatever, or return. So, hindi ba factor din yun? So, paano natin matitiyak na sineseryoso ng tao at hindi lang sila nagmamadali, or baka naman, I don't know, hypothetical lang siguro, no? Baka on the ground, siguro naglalaba. Tapos biglang lalapitan, oy, magsa-survey po kami. Pwede ba yun?
Generally, may ethics din dapat si interviewer on how they will interact with their interviewee. Siyempre, pag busy, you give them a space to do what they're doing because you don't want them to be uncomfortable in the survey. Now, in the conduct of the survey. Now, yung aning sinabi mo kanina na parang nagmamadali, it is sometimes a factor in some surveys na talagang sobrang haba na pwedeng magkaroon ng respondent fatigue na tinatawag. For those instances, generally, survey interviewers would be open to gaano katagal yung survey, and also generally before a survey is conducted, the design of the questionnaire is at least constructed in a way na these respondent fatigues would be reduced but still be able to capture a lot of questions. So there is a lot of disclosure that is necessary for that interviewers have to disclose respondents in terms of the conduct of the survey, and interviewers are professional enough to recognize how they would be conducting the survey to facilitate yung respondents' participation.
Okay. Thank you for that. So, marami kang mga na-mention na mga limitations, no? Na dapat sundan, ganyan. So, I guess I just want you um to ask again, ano ba sa tingin mo yung pros and cons of doing surveys? Like, kunwari, merong comment dito sa isa dito. Wait, na-scroll, I just scrolled past it, but I saw na parang, yung isang tao dito sinasabi niya essentially, sa comment section na, dapat hindi na lang daw nag-surveys kasi kung walang surveys, wala daw mababash ng mga tao o kaya at least blind daw yung mga tao sa kung ano mangyayari tapos malalaman mo na lang sa mismong election. So I guess, ano yung sa tingin mong pros and cons of doing surveys given na may mga ganitong sentiments na right now, given that yung mga ganito is mas madaling ma-absorb or mas madaling makita ng mga tao dahil sa social media?
Well, yung pro ng isang survey is at least there is an understanding of what are the sentiments of the population. Now that we can see how people would react to it, and there would be certain reactions to it naturally. Pero I don't believe that people should be blind. Yung gulatan na lang pagdating ng election, oh, ito na pala, hello, ito na pala presidente. Ano yun, parang, ano yun, na parang, sandali lang, ano yung nangyari? So, it's also that kind of thing na it is best to know, at least, so that we can make decisions. Yun naman yung idea of statistics eh. Having this information or these numerical values reflecting how we make decisions. That's one purpose of having statistics, to aid in decision making. And another one, it's also for us to really the way that we have surveys. One pro of having these surveys is that besides hindi ka na lang magugulat, at least you can put some context of the general perceptions of people, and it's good information in terms of yun nga, you already know what is the general perception of the population. And in a way, in some kinds of polls, like exit polls, at least you can put, parang kaya mong i-benchmark with what you're seeing with the election results. But that's for specific for exit polls, I would say. Pero at least yung parang may openness and may availability of information so that we can make these decisions. Yung general reflection that I have about that. Yeah. Well, with the con, surveys can be perceived one way or the other. There have been some results in psychological research that there are certain biases din naman talaga that can be introduced by surveys. And these are really part of psychological behavior. May mga iba, I've been hearing a lot of this, what they call bandwagon effect. But there's also this motivator effect na parang, ay, nakikita na nila na ito yung trend. Sige, halabira to do more activities. So sometimes you have a lot of these confounding of effects possible to surveys. So may isa pang uri ng effect na tinatawag na since alam mo nang mananalo, bakit ka pa boboto? There's also that kind of effect as well. So may mga, and this is either from supporters or non-supporters of any candidate, so to speak. So may mga ganong effects that could happen. How big of a factor are these effects? I, as independent of these survey firms, don't know that information. It's typically internal to these survey firms kung ano yung parang possible effect to people of these surveys. So that's how far I could go with that.
Mm.
Yeah, actually, gusto ko pa sanang put it a notch higher dahil na-mention mo na nga yung mga effects, no? I think siguro yung question is, sa tingin mo ba nagagamit yung mga survey sa mind conditioning? Kasi, for example, yung mga hindi naman legitimate o kaya yung gusto lang talagang manggulo or use it for propaganda, I would say yun yung goal nila. But for some, for the legitimate polling firms, yung kanilang survey ba, results, could it be used by propagandists for mind conditioning purposes also?
Now, with the survey results, kung illegitimate, yon alam mo nang for some way that they could use propaganda yun eh. For some legitimately designed surveys, um, these are coming from these firms and propagandists will use any tool that they want. Yun naman talaga yung nature nila
Right.
eh. So really, yun, based on their job description, propagandist, it is the way that they would be mind conditioning. So that is something outside of the activities of legitimate survey firms. And these are some things that survey firms really cannot control. But this is
Mm-hmm.
some, what I think about these are that if you are a citizen for truth, then you already have a way of tackling against propagandists with negative types of activities or behavior.
Mm. Now, Peter, I want to ask, what's the worst that you've seen? Worst type of survey that you've seen lately? Yung
Hmm.
pinakapangit na nakita mo na parang, alam mo ba,
Nako.
parang sobrang, what the hell is this? Parang we shouldn't even talk about this. Parang ganong level.
Sige. Well, this has already been mentioned dun sa statement namin sa UT School of Statistics, ano, yung paglitaw ng mga unethical forms of doing surveys. Yun yung pinaka problemado eh. Like yung videos of Kalia surveys done by some vloggers and suspicious online surveys din. Another one would be, alam mo, if you know that a survey can be abused, that's already a bad survey. That's one thing that I will say about that. So, the example of the Twitter survey or Facebook survey, alam mong since they could be abused, they are by their construction bad surveys. The Kalya surveys, the problem with that is, paano yun nagawa na random ang isang Kalya survey? And oftentimes, these Kalya surveys may be very prodding and are unethical in terms of how they interact with with their interviewees, na parang prodding, or you could have it na parang they're displaying uh, grave non-verbal cues to intimidate respondents. So yun yung medyo problemado sa mga ganung uri survey. In general, pag alam mo yung survey kayang abusuhin, that's a bad survey.
Mm. Now, but of course, we know the big ones. We have Pulse Asia, we have SWS, but there are also new survey firms that have emerged and have their own results and analysis. Now, what are the first things that readers should look out for to determine na mapagkakatiwalaan itong mga bagong kumpanyang ito? Or, I wouldn't say new, pero parang lately ko lang napansin because of the elections.
So, one thing that I've said yung dun sa representation, to assess the representativeness of the survey. Another one would be to really look at the reputation side naman of the survey conducted or the survey company. So in terms of reputation, are these commissioned or non-commissioned surveys? Kasi now, some commissioned surveys could be fine, some might not. Kasi commission surveys might have specific questions na gusto nilang maitanong. Besides that, whether commission on commission, they still have to work on certain research ethics. Another one would be to look at the company itself. You look at the company itself in terms of who are those connected to the company and what are the other activities of these companies. Kasi if they are really survey research firms, they shouldn't be working on other aspects that could influence or could be a conflict of interest. Kasi medyo problemado kung ang isang survey result is being given out by a company na pwedeng may conflict of interest on those survey results. So that's one thing that we should be very careful about. So yung ganyung reputation aspect. You should also look at the people behind those surveys in terms of, again, these possible conflicts of interest, especially in terms of the other activities that these other individuals linked to these survey firms are doing. So, because again, the thing here is that we would like these surveys to really reflect ethical research. Yun naman yung point
Mm.
doon.
Actually, Peter, babalikan ko lang yung mga natanong na natin to kanina, but I've been seeing these comments kasi na bumabalik tayo na parang paano daw na determine yung yung pulso ng bayan na parang over 100 million Filipinos. Well, ilan lang ba yung voting population? 60, I think.
Yeah. Typically around 60 million. I believe naging 63
Yeah.
or 65 million na ngayon.
Yeah, so pakilinaw lang po ulit sa mga kasi ito nakita ko na naman ulit papaano ma-represent ng over 2,000 people or I don't know 2,600, di ba? Yung usual or ano ba? 2,300, 2,600.
The lowest that I've seen is 1,200. The highest that I have seen could be 3,600. So around those numbers.
Oo. So yun, pakilinaw lang sa mga nanonood. Papaano nare-reflect ng opinion ng ganito lamang kaliit na bilang kumpara doon sa populasyon na voting population na 60 million? Papaano nagagawa to ng statistics?
So it's really about a proper sampling design. So long as you know the level of where you want your estimates to be accurate, and to design an approach that is both meticulous scientifically and also based on a scientific random process, based on a lot of theories of mathematics and statistics coming into play, and taking into consideration the margin of error and the level of confidence that the survey has pegged themselves into. Oftentimes, for a specific area, it could be around 300, 400, or 600. And once you accumulate it to a lot of the macro areas that these surveys are doing, sometimes you get as low as 1,200 or 1,400 and as high as 3,600, depending on, again, yung ganung level of their margin of error, level of confidence, and how they have designed their sampling. And these are well supported in statistical theory and mathematics. I wouldn't have enough time to discuss that, the mathematics of it all and the statistics of it all, because that's one full course in a stat program.
Oo. Pero ito, yung ano ba, plus and minus, ano ba nakikita natin usually?
Margin of error.
Plus and minus 2% or ano bang?
Yan ang sa national
Margin of
typically.
error.
Yeah,
Margin
yeah.
of error.
So to reach that, ano yung mga kailangang gawin? In a nutshell, I know it's complicated, pero help
Sige.
us
So generally,
understand
it's
this.
going to be a properly designed representative sampling procedure to reach that. And once you have a properly designed survey, you can often reach that number. You cannot know the true percent because to know that true percent, that's going to be a census of everyone in an election setup. But at least for that point in time, they're able to get, for that point in time, and based on the understanding of the mathematics and statistics of it, that plus or minus 2%, given that sample size and given the level of confidence, will work out.
So it also means na careful selection of
yes.
The region, the areas and the people,
yes.
ano ba, the age, tama ba? May age factor din, di ba?
Generally,
or that's
yung
ano
age
na.
factor is just for the voting, filtering the voting population. Kasi generally, dapat proper selection of the individuals at the barangay level, and typically these would be field work na eh. So a randomly selected house, a properly randomly selected house in an area, and from that house, titingnan kung ilan yung voting age individuals, and then randomly selecting those voting age, randomly selecting a person out of that uh, household of voting age population, around a household of voting age members. So yung magiging ganon. Generally, it's just keeping into that properly designed sampling na parang proper selection of area, barangay, household, individual for a lot of these survey firms doing election surveys.
Mm. So again, thanks so much for your time and helping us understand this really complicated yet important issue. Thanks so much, Peter Julian Caton of the UP School of Statistics. And I'm Ralph Rivas.
And I'm Ikaray.
And this has been another episode of By the Numbers. Thanks for tuning in.